Imagine me and you, I do. I think about you day and night. It's only right to think about the girl you love and hold her tight.
Welcome to Crazy Carrot Studios. My name is James, and today we will be going over the basics of UI. Now, for those of you who do not know, UI stands for User Interface. Now, on a canvas, the Rect Transform is a new transform component that is used for all UI elements. While the Rect Transform has position, rotation, and scale, just like any other transform, it also has a width and a height used to specify the dimensions of the canvas rectangle. Now, to explain the pivot system, I'm going to bring this image in here so you can see exactly what's going to be going on. Now, you will notice here that we are set up in the middle pivot. Now, if we click here in the upper left, in the image, you notice the pivot changed. Same thing with the upper right. Again, in the bottom left. And lastly, the bottom right. Now, just so you can see what the pivot is doing, we have it here in the bottom left. When I rotate the image, you can notice it pivots along that bottom left. Now, when we show it again with the pivot in the center, then when we rotate, you will notice now that it's rotating the entire block from the center pivot point. Now let's go over the position. In order to create the position, you need to hit the Alt and select the one you want. Notice, unlike the pivot, when you set the position, it actually moves to the section you're looking at. So not only does it go to each position, it can be stretched across the screen in the horizontal or vertical positions. It can also be stretched across the entire canvas by selecting the bottom most right. Let's go ahead and set our resolution to something standard that most people have, 1920 by, let's say, 1080. Usually you want to set it with the resolution that you're going to be looking at it through, but in this particular case, I believe most people have a 1920 by 1080, but if you look through the different options, if you have a 4K, by all means, use a 3840 by 2160. It's just going to allow you to see things a little bit more clearer when you're going through this. Now, when we go through a canvas, you're not going to see it through the normal scene view. What we need to do is go to 2D and either double click or just highlight the canvas and hit F to focus it in. So in this particular case, we're going to go ahead and right click, hit a UI, and we're going to add an image to this. Now, for this particular one, I'm going to go ahead and Alt, and I'm going to move everything over to the left-hand side and stretch it, just like we showed a little bit earlier. From here, I'm going to also change my color of my image by clicking in here, and we're just going to give it a default green or whatever you feel like making it look like. I am going to stretch this out so that it's going to look appropriate for a side view menu of some sort. You can look at the game view and kind of see what that's going to look like. And actually, the more I look at it, that green is really going to clash with my ground. So let's make this like this. There we go. That makes it a little bit different. Give it a little bit darker look. Definitely don't want that green on green. It looked horrible. Now, you notice here when we resize our Rect Transform, my pivots stay exactly the same. Now, what this is going to enable us to do is, let's say we're in the game view, and I want to switch between different ratios of a screen. You notice that the left-hand side, our menu stays in the exact same spot no matter which one I go to. And that's because we have it locked into the left-hand corners. Everything starts at the base root, which is 0x, 0 width. But because we have our pivot to the left, it's moving it and starting it from there. If we had our pivot to the right, it'd be completely the opposite side. So let's go ahead and look and see. Right now, if we set this thing to with a position of 45, And let's do this one at even 100. Tell you what, we'll do a 50 and 100, make this completely even. And we switch this over to the other side. You notice the 100 stayed the same because we're still going up and down the same way. But we're now going minus 50 from this pivot point. And that's the difference on the pivots. Let's go ahead and reset this back to the left-hand side. Let's rename our image, and let's call it here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to call this one background, just so you can. It's always a good idea to label your UI. That way, if you come back to it later, you know what you were trying to do with that particular object. Inside of our canvas, again, we're going to go to the UI, and we're going to create some buttons. Now, just so you know, if you notice on mine, I'm using TextMesh Pro. If you've never used that before, you might want to go into Windows, go to your Package Manager, and look for TextMesh Pro in the Packages and Project. Yours might not be there, it might be in the registry, but look for TextMesh Pro. Once you have it in there, you want to install it. Now mine's already in there, so I can't download or install, so once you get that into your system, we can go from there. Now, in here, we're going to go ahead and create a UI button with TextMesh Pro. We'll go ahead and import them. I don't need the examples. Now, our button, notice, came way over here to the left-hand side. That's because it's parented to the canvas, so it's automatically put into the center of the canvas. Now, if we were to change that by parenting it to the background itself, you'll notice if we go UI, button, and add it to the image of our background, it centers it to it. As you can see here, we are centered in the rect transform of the background. Now you will notice that our button has an element underneath it called the text. That is the text that's inside the button, and it keeps it separate from the button itself. The button will have a component called button, which allows you to have on-click events, and of course our text will have a component for the text. Now let's go ahead and rename our button. Right-click and go to Rename. Let's call it Create. Now in our text, let's go ahead and rename it inside the inspector to Create as well. Actually, let's rename this to Create_button so that we know exactly what we're dealing with. Now let's give our button a color. Let's go over to the image and select a color that we want. Let's say a dark blue, purplish, green. That looks like a pretty good background to it. Let's make that a little bit darker. And I think that'll do. So now we're going to go over and duplicate this button. And let's change the name. We're going to call this one Move Button. Let's remove that one at the end because that's just cloning it, saying it's a duplicate. And for the text, let's go ahead and change that to Move as well. Now we can adjust it through the Steam view like this, so they're not right on top of each other, but I have a better way to show you a little bit later. So let's duplicate this one. Let's call this one here Rotate Button. Again, let's remove that one at the end. And in the text, make sure it's also labeled for rotate. Now I guess it would help if I had spelled rotate correctly in here, so let's rename that and put the T in there where it was supposed to go. Alright, now let's go back and let's duplicate this one. And this one we were going to name color or change color, whatever you prefer. I think I'm just going to stick with color button. I think we know what that's going to be. And then let's go ahead and take the one off the end. And just to change it up a little bit, let's duplicate it from up here in the background by creating a new UI button. Now the problem with doing it this way is it did not inherit the color or any of the others. So let's go ahead and we're going to call this one Destroy Button. Let's go ahead and make sure we add the text to it. And then we're going to have to add the color back into this one as well. So We're going to call this one Destroy. Then let's go back to the Destroy button. And let's change the color to the same. Let's use our picker. That way we keep it consistent. Now here I'm going to show you a little trick about how to keep it all running the same way by adding a component that's known as a vertical layout group. Now you add this in here and you notice how it spaced out our buttons for us. Now this is a little spread out. So let's first adjust some of these component things. Let's start with centering it with the middle center. And then we're going to adjust it by deselecting the height so that the parent is not controlling the height. Now obviously we want that to be gapped a little bit. So let's go to the spacing here and let's go with 100 and see how that looks. Now what's happening is this is conforming to the rect transform of our parent. But let's bring our sizes up on our buttons. Let's make it 300 in the width and on the height 60. Now when I go to the game view to look at this, this is reasonable. It doesn't look too bad. If we look at a different resolution, you notice it stays the same. Everything looks proper. So let's go back into our scene view and let's add a few more things to our UI. Now I want to create a text button to handle our function for creating a text. So let's go back to the UI. Let's go ahead and duplicate our button one more time. And we're going to rename this one to text_button, I think. Yeah, that sounds good. And then let's go ahead and remove that one again. And actually, the more I think about it, let's make this name text, because that's what we're going to be doing with it. Now let's go ahead and move this to the top so that it's sitting in the top of our UI when we're looking at it. And we will rename the text value to name so that our button is reading correctly. Now I also want a text for our title of our menu here. So we're going to go ahead and UI and text. And on this one here, we're going to call it title. And then in the text section of the inspector, let's give it a name like My UI. That sounds like it'll do. Of course, you can name it however you want. And we're going to move this to the very top so it's represented on the top of the UI section. Now we're going to take our title and move it outside of the background image. Then we're going to create an empty game object and call this button panel. We are going to use this panel as a holder for all of our buttons. And this way we can create its own rect transform to keep everything in. So the panel will inherit everything and stretch across the entire background. Then we're going to take all the buttons and move them inside the panel so they are child of the button panel. Now we're going to remove this vertical layout group and put it onto the button panel. Now you can do this by copying the component, going to button panel, and then in the three dots, go to paste component as new. Now you notice it brings everything down, and that's because we need to set our button panel to inherit the total width and height of the background, just like we've done before. Now in this particular case, we're going to go ahead and drag this down until we find a good spot for the panel to start to sit. I didn't want it all the way to the top. I want to leave room for the title. And let's give it about the same, about a gap or something close to for the bottom. Now that we've got that, let's go ahead and go to that button panel and select the height. And let's move the spacing down to 15. Now you notice it brought it all closer together and it looks pretty good, and it left us a nice little gap on top of the title. So we're going to bring the title back in and we're going to set it as part of the background. So you're going to have a child to the background for the title, and then the button panel, and then children of the button panel will be all the buttons. We're going to change our color to our title to, let's say, a red, a darker red. And then I want to center it using the alignment in the text component here to make sure they're centered, both the height and the width of that text element. Now I want to create one more text, and we're going to do this on the canvas. UI, text, and then I want to name this one name. And then the inspector, let's go ahead and change the new text to name as well. And now that I'm thinking about it as well, let's go back over to the name, and I'm going to add name underscore text, just to be clear what this name is. And it's not a button, it is a text element. Now let's go and let's move this up so that it looks towards the top and the middle. I'm going to attach a color to it, and let's make this one, let's see what a dark blue is going to look like. That should be fine. And let's make sure we've got it centered. And let's click B for bold and auto size. There, that looks pretty good. Next, I want to stretch it out just a little bit in case our name is a little longer, that it'll all fit inside when we set up our functions. And then I'm going to recenter it back to the middle and reset the pivot to the middle as well. Now, I did make one mistake earlier. When we did the rotate and change color, I did not change the name for the change color in the text element. So you may want to go back and do that by going to the text and then in the inspector changing the name. Excellent. Now it should look like this. So now we have a completed UI that we can carry on into our next video. Now when we come back next time, we will create a new script that will attach functions to these buttons. And from all of us at Crazy Carrot Studios, we would like to say thank you. And don't forget to please like and subscribe. We will see you next time when we get back to Learning with Bob.
The sky